Libya's parliament has voted to approve an interim unity government to lead the war-ravaged nation to December elections as part of a UN-backed peace plan. The oil-rich country has been torn apart by conflict since the 2011 uprising that toppled dictator Muammar Gaddafi.
After 2 days of intense debate, Parliament approved Prime Minister Abdul Ahmed Dabbas's cabinet with 121 votes. The new cabinet includes 33 ministers, 2 deputy prime ministers, who are representative of Libya's different geographic areas and social segments. Though Dabbas's appointment has been met with criticism, today's vote has inspired hope for many locals.
This is a positive step, despite being a very late one, which caused the Libyan people to suffer a great deal. We hope to God that this government is a source of good in unifying Libyans, being a first step in building the country.
The country has been divided by 2 rival governments, one in the east and another in the west, each backed by a vast array of militia, as well as foreign powers. But amending the constitution and holding free elections in 2021 remains one of the biggest challenges facing Dabbas's government.
Sami Hamdi is the editor-in-chief of The Interest, which is a United Kingdom-based international magazine, and is a regular commentator on Middle East and North Africa. He joins us now via Skype from London. Sami, always good to talk to you. I guess this is pretty historic, isn't it? I mean, to have a unified executive in this way, agreeing on something, signing it off, and here we are.
I think it's significant insofar as this particular signing took place on Libyan territory as opposed to in Skhirat in Morocco, which was where the last government was signed and agreed upon by the Libyan parties. I think it's also a positive step in that it marks a break with the warmongering that we saw beforehand, and it marks an agreement, irrespective of how this agreement has come about. It marks an agreement that the next stage should be one of political wrestling, a continued political wrestling, as opposed to settling things via the barrel of the gun. I also think it's important, or it's a positive step in that what the Prime Minister Dbeibeh managed to do was he managed to give as many Libyans a role in this government, as many positions for other Libyan factions, so that they might help him pass this particular government. And finally, the other positive development, I put this positive, of course, with between quotation marks, is that it is absolutely clear in that the US now has a firm stance over what it wants in Libya. Before, it was simply interested in seeing who the winner was. But given the extensive statements that were coming out of Washington and the US Embassy in Libya, asserting in no uncertain terms exactly what it expected of the parties that were going to vote on the government, in that the US clearly wanted everybody to vote for this government. There's a clear indication that the US is making it absolutely clear this is the government that it wants to succeed. It wants to see a successful political process. It wants to see elections, perhaps not necessarily because it is in the interests of Libyans, more primarily to drive out the Russians. But nevertheless, this beast that is the US is making its presence known, and everybody appears to be trying to work around it as opposed to countering it.
Is this partly because Joe Biden is now president? Would Donald Trump have had a different stance? And why suddenly is America's presence being felt? What about the other big powers of the world?
I think it's important to highlight that while we are making a lot of Biden's impact on Libya and indeed on other crisis zones, it's important to highlight that Biden is actually continuing a lot of what Trump has done with regards to the peace processes that are taking place. We're seeing that he's continuing with the peace process in Afghanistan, offering a quota government, a shared government between the Taliban and between the Afghan government. And we're seeing in Libya that the political process, which was started by Donald Trump in a reaction to Russian entrenchment in Libya, Biden is continuing with the outcomes of this political process and continuing with asserting that this political process should be abided by. So I think this is not necessarily a Biden initiative, but more a follow-on from a reaction from the US which is that its foreign policy under Donald Trump, or its foreign policy of waiting to see who the winner is, essentially gave room for Russia to expand. And given that Russia threatens to entrench itself in Libya, the US has come storming in, has sought to prevent Russia, Turkey, and Egypt from monopolizing the political process. It's recommended its own political process through the UN. Everybody seems to have been forced to toe the line with this political process. There's still political wrangling behind the scenes. But essentially, the US now, rather than being a party that is sitting on the fence, is coming in and saying, this is what I want. I want this Prime Minister Abdulhamid Dbeiba to succeed. I want elections to come about. I don't want you talking with Moscow without talking to me. I have to be part of this political process. And I think for the Libyan factions who are still shifting between the different powers, I think for them, the US is still a force to be reckoned with and still a force to listen to.
Beyond managing Russia, is there anything else perhaps on the agenda for the US with this new administration in Libya?
I think that's a very good question. I think that it's always important to remember that one US foreign policy is rarely ever driven by human rights, nor is it necessarily driven by conflict resolution in the interest of the local people, but primarily, of course, to assert US hegemony and to benefit from that US hegemony. I think that in this regard, I think the US's approach in Libya is primarily driven by a need to push back Russia first and foremost, but also to discipline its other allies, such as Turkey, such as the UAE, such as Egypt, who have also been involved in Libya. It's important to highlight that for the Biden administration, the biggest problem that it has in foreign policy is that it has alienated too many allies at the same time, even allies who are fighting each other. So it's alienated Turkey by insisting on supporting the Kurds in Syria. It's alienated Egypt by pushing for a political process that includes the Muslim Brotherhood in Libya. It's also alienated Egypt by not taking a firm stance on the Renaissance Dam in Egypt's clash with Ethiopia. It's alienated Saudi Arabia through the Khashoggi report and essentially humiliating Mohammed bin Salman publicly. And the US is feeling that because it's alienated so many allies at once, there's suddenly a greater opportunity for China and Russia to sweep in and establish these ties of their own. The Biden administration is now caught in a very difficult situation whereby it wants to discipline these allies, such as Turkey, by supplanting Turkey's military gains in Libya, by demanding that Turkey rein in its military expansion in Syria. But it's trying to do that without alienating the other allies. It's trying to rein in Mohammed bin Salman without pushing the UAE, who perhaps will feel that Biden is being too harsh, from pursuing relations with Russia and China. So the Biden administration policy in Libya is twofold. One, it's about pushing back Russia, but it's also about reasserting US hegemony and asserting discipline amongst US allies, which is far more complicated and far more difficult for Biden. And it may well be that the US assertion over this government, over this Libyan government, its assertion that everybody should respect it, its the willingness to deploy extensive diplomatic pressure towards that as well, may actually result in this alienation of allies.
It's a historic day, as you said, for many reasons, but I guess also quite symbolic for Libyans, for them to watch this. It must be giving them some kind of hope that a new Libya is coming out slowly but surely.
I think it depends what future we're considering when we talk about whether Libya will be a success or not. The reality is that it was international intervention that ousted Gaddafi. It was international intervention that facilitated the civil war. It was international intervention that ended the civil war. And it was international intervention that forced the parties to talk. And now it's international intervention that has forced the parties to recognize the outcomes of the talks that they were forced into. So in other words, in none of these processes have we seen actual Libyans taking any decisions for themselves. And therefore, that begs the question as to whether international intervention will be required to force a respecting of any election outcome if international intervention is not required to bring those elections about in the first place. This is why the saying that was said at the time when NATO intervened in Libya, that Libyans had sold their country in exchange for limited freedom, suddenly now rings very loud, in that how the government is being formed is through negotiations with international powers who are then speaking to their Libyan proxies and then asserting to what extent they are willing to accept gains or willing to accept certain positions. And this is why, and I think every Africans will resonate with this, it's important to understand to what extent we are willing to accept a country to be led in this way, to be governed in this way, to be dictated to in this way, or to what extent there should be more of an ability to towards or more a trajectory towards accountability, towards Libyan agency. And I think this is the difficult balance that we're trying to achieve with regards to Libya. And I think the clearest example of this is that you have to remember that the current Prime Minister of Libya, his family name is synonymous with the Gaddafi regime that was accused of corruption and accused of dictatorship. The fact that this is seen as the new hope, that this sort of nostalgia, this sort of a Gaddafi era individual leading Libya now to this new era is ironic in and of itself, but it also shows how the goalposts have moved since the NATO intervention in Libya that ousted the Gaddafi. And this is why when we're looking at the future of Libya and where we're going, it's important to highlight what criteria we're using to judge it. Things got so bad that it cannot get any worse. And I think it is from this mentality that we're celebrating this government. It's from this mentality that people are celebrating the return of the US. It's from this mentality that we're celebrating elections that we're not even sure will produce a result that necessarily reflects the will of the Libyan people. The reality is that we're not out of the difficult situation, despite the positive headlines that might come out. We're taking baby steps, but I think that's a testament as to how far Libya has fallen from an age in which perhaps it was deemed one of the most influential countries.
All right. In some ways, you may have partly answered my next question is, what will this interim administration be able to do for the rest of this year? And could this be a dress rehearsal for something that might look like a coalition government at the end of this journey?
I think that when the government was first announced following the outcomes of the political dialogue, there were fears it would be an impotent government, and these fears are still there. However, with the loud insistence of the US administration that this government should be supported and a willingness on the part of Biden to actually support this government in a manner Trump perhaps was not necessarily willing to do, I think there's now this sense that this government may actually have some teeth to it. And indeed, while the government has been voted on today, there is an assumption that very soon we will see a reorganizing of this government, a reshuffling of ministers now that Dbeibah has got his vote. In other words, that he will, now that he got the vote for his government, he no longer needs approval for any ministerial changes that he makes. So in other words, we're expecting him to try to assert himself and stamp his mark on a government that currently looks like a coalition. So we will see him trying to attempt during this year to make his mark on this government, not necessarily because he wants to run for elections. The political process, the agreement was that he would be prime minister, and because he's prime minister, he's not allowed to run in the next elections. But rather what we will see is the US, through Dbeibah, will try to cement itself in this political process. We'll see international haggling over different ministries. Dbeibah will try to balance these international interests while, of course, managing the Libyan interests. The direct answer to your question is nobody knows exactly how much this Libyan government will be able to actually enact change on the ground. What is expected, though, is that we are going to see a lot of political wrestling as people jostle on the assumption that elections will come, if not at the end of the year, then at least within the next year or perhaps even the year after. But irrespective, there will be this political jostling. There will be these sort of negotiations, perhaps even coalition groups forming in a bid to secure an electoral victory that will deliver them to power. I know it sounds bleak, the assessment that I'm given, but the reality is that we have to take things as they come, one step at a time. The reality is that it's true, we have to celebrate that we're no longer shooting guns at one another, and that at least they're talking at the table about these issues. But I do think that there are a lot of complicated issues, mass graves, accountability, corruption and the like, that won't be easily resolved. And what the Libyans fear more than anything is that the price for peace will be accepting corruption, accepting lack of accountability, and simply sweeping all of the war crimes under the carpet for the sake of a false peace that the Libyans won't even be the prime beneficiaries of.
All right, we've run out of time, but a quick answer for my final question, if you can. It's one thing to be forced to the table, forced to sign agreements, and perhaps set up something that looks like a unified front. But actual real reconciliation and real change happen in hearts and minds. How will they get to a place of genuine reconciliation? Is that something that's in the far horizon, or could it happen in the near future?
There is a verse in the Quran, and I think it's relevant here, given that Libya is overwhelmingly Muslim, that when God told Moses to tell his people to go take Jerusalem, they said, Moses, go you and your Lord and fight. We'll be here sitting down. We're not interested in it. We're tired of, we don't want to go and fight. So the verse says that God forbade the entry of Jerusalem for them for 40 years. In other words, he waited for that generation to die out, and then the next generation were able to enter Jerusalem. I think somewhat perhaps it may well be that this applies to Libya, in that this generation will not be able to find reconciliation, that it will need a new generation that didn't live through the civil war that will achieve that long-awaited reconciliation.
Sami Hamdi, always good to talk to you. Your insights and analysis greatly appreciated. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Peter.